Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
People always say, I never saw it coming, and honestly, that's exactly how it was for me. My wife and I had been together for 4 solid years, married the whole time. I genuinely thought we had a good thing going. We had plans, an entire life mapped out, and for the most part, I truly believed we were on the same page. Here's the thing. We both wanted kids, or at least I thought we did. Right after we got married, we started talking about it seriously. She would always talk about wanting 2 or 3 kids, imagining what we'd name them, how we'd decorate the nursery, the works. She'd spend hours online looking at baby clothes and gadgets, planning this future life for us and our kids. It was our thing, something that brought us closer. We were excited, ready to take that next step together, and everything seemed perfect. But then, out of nowhere, we were hit with news that completely knocked the wind out of me. After a few months of trying to have kids with no success, we decided to see a doctor to figure out what was going on. Long story short, it was me. My count was way too low, and the doctor told us our chances of having kids naturally were slim to none. It felt like a punch to the gut. I was crushed. All those plans we'd made just vanished in an instant. The news hit me hard, really hard. I ended up in a pretty dark place for a while. Therapy eventually helped, but in the beginning, I was a wreck. At first, my wife seemed supportive. She said it didn't matter, and that she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. But even then, something about the way she said it felt off, like she had already moved on from the idea too quickly. It didn't sit right with me. One minute, she was all about having a family, and the next, she was saying she didn't need kids to be happy. Don't get me wrong. I understand that people can change their minds, but her whole attitude felt off. She went from daydreaming about baby names to completely avoiding any talk about kids. It wasn't just that, though. It felt like she started seeing me differently, too. Out of nowhere, she'd make these little digs at me, things she'd never said before. Comments about how I wasn't taking care of myself, how maybe I should get in shape, or be more productive around the house. Sure, I'd put on a few pounds, but it felt like she was just finding reasons to blame me for things. When I confronted her about the sudden change in attitude, she brushed it off. She'd tell me I was imagining things, that I was being overly sensitive, but I knew something wasn't right. The woman I married, the one who used to sit with me for hours talking about our future, she was different. She wasn't outright mean, but there was this coldness about her, like she'd already checked out mentally and was just going through the motions. Over time, I started to believe her when she said everything was fine. I stopped pushing because I didn't want to come across as insecure or needy. Fast forward a few years, and we were just going through the motions of daily life. We barely talked about anything meaningful. It was like we were more like roommates than husband and wife. I tried bringing up other options, like adoption or surrogacy, but every time, she shut the conversation down. She'd say, I'm happy as long as we're together. But deep down, I never really believed her. It felt like she was trying to convince herself more than she was trying to convince me. Then, out of the blue, she tells me she wants to go on a girls' trip. Now, it wasn't unusual for her to take trips with her friends. She'd done it a few times before, and I always supported her. We lived in Brighton, and she talked for a while about wanting to visit America with her friends. I didn't think twice about it. We had built up trust over the years, so I even helped her pack, made sure she had everything she needed, and dropped her off at the airport. I remember the last thing she said before she left. She turned to me and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." I thought it was a little odd, like I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary, but she seemed so genuine that I brushed it off as her just being appreciative. That night, I stayed up so I could call her when she landed, just to make sure everything had gone smoothly. Her flight was supposed to take about 9 hours, so I kept myself busy around the house, watching TV, checking the clock, and waiting for her text to say she'd landed. When I saw her flight had touched down, I gave her a call to check in. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I figured she was probably exhausted and went straight to her hotel to crash, so I didn't think much of it. But when morning came and I still hadn't heard from her, I started to worry. I started feeling this gnawing worry in the pit of my stomach. I tried calling her again and sent a few texts, thinking maybe she was just busy or her phone was on silent. But as more hours passed with no response, my concern turned into full-blown panic. I called her sister, hoping she'd heard from her, but she hadn't. By now, I was really starting to freak out. Desperate, I even called her friends, the ones she said she'd be traveling with, thinking maybe something had gone wrong with her phone or she hadn't had the chance to check in. But when I got in touch with them, they were just as confused. They weren't on the trip with her. In fact, they were 2 blocks away, sitting at a coffee shop back home. That's when it hit me. She wasn't on a girls' trip. She wasn't with friends. She hadn't gone anywhere with anyone. She was just gone. I sat there holding the phone, feeling like my stomach had dropped through the floor. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why would she lie to me? Why would she leave without saying anything? At first, I tried convincing myself it was some kind of mistake. Maybe she'd missed a connecting flight or there'd been an emergency, and she hadn't been able to call. But deep down, I knew. This had been planned. The whole girl's trip story, her saying thank you for being supportive. It was all part of something she'd been planning in her head. I felt like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. This wasn't the woman I married. She was someone I didn't even recognize anymore. Suddenly, all the pieces started falling into place. The coldness, her avoidance of conversations about our future, those subtle jabs about my appearance and health. She'd been pulling away for a long time, and I either hadn't noticed or hadn't wanted to see it. That night, I just sat there staring at my phone, hoping for a text, a call, anything. But nothing came. Deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The next morning, I woke up and lay there, staring at the ceiling, hoping it was all just some horrible dream. But her side of the bed was empty, and reality hit me like a ton of bricks. She'd actually left. She packed her bags and vanished, and all the reassurances I'd told myself the night before, that maybe she was delayed or her phone had died, crumbled. It was obvious she'd planned this and wanted out. In those first few days, I was in complete denial. I kept calling her phone, hoping to hear her voice or get an explanation. I left message after message, not even sure what to say half the time, just hoping something would get through to her. But all I got was silence, which somehow made it worse. It felt like she'd left me to figure it all out on my own, as if I'd been a stranger to her all along. At first, her family was just as shocked as I was. Her mom had no idea about her plans and hadn't heard from her either. I ended up going over to their house more times than I could count, talking to her mom and searching for answers. I think they felt sorry for me. Her mom would let me stay the night sometimes, even cooking meals for me when I couldn't bring myself to eat. She'd sit and listen as I talked about all the little things that didn't make sense, trying to piece together how my life had suddenly fallen apart. Some nights, I just sat there in silence, too numb to speak. I swung between extremes: anger, sadness, guilt. I kept asking myself what I'd done wrong. Had I missed some sign? Had I not given her enough attention? I spent countless hours replaying every conversation, every disagreement, trying to figure out what had pushed her to leave. I became consumed by it, obsessing over how I might have saved our marriage or what I could have done differently. I know it sounds dramatic, but I felt like finding an answer was the only way to make sense of it all, as if understanding could somehow fix everything. I barely ate, barely slept, and my work started to suffer. People noticed and would ask if I was okay, but I just shrug it off and say I was dealing with personal stuff. It felt too embarrassing to admit the truth, that my wife had left me without a word. Eventually, I opened up to a couple of close friends. They did their best to keep me distracted, dragging me out to hang out and encouraging me to move on. But even when I was with them, I was stuck in my own head, constantly thinking about her, wondering where she was and why I wasn't enough to make her stay. One of the hardest parts was dealing with the questions from people who didn't know. Neighbors, family, friends, even old coworkers who'd heard I was married would ask, "How's married life?" or "How's your wife?" Every time, it felt like ripping off a fresh scab. I didn't have the courage to tell them she'd left, so I'd just smile and say, "Everything's fine." But each time I told that lie, it felt heavier. Therapy ended up being the thing that helped the most. I'd never considered it before, but after months of barely functioning, I realized I couldn't handle it alone anymore. I found a therapist and started going weekly, talking to someone neutral, someone who didn't know her, me, or our history, made a difference. In those sessions, I vented about the anger, the betrayal, and the emptiness she left behind. I talked about the sleepless nights spent replaying everything over and over in my mind. The therapist helped me understand that there wasn't some magic moment or action that would have made her stay. She chose to leave, and that was on her, not me. It was a hard truth to accept. For the longest time, I believed something was wrong with me, that I'd somehow driven her away. But slowly, I began to see things differently. She'd been cold and distant for a long time, and I had ignored it, hoping things would somehow fix themselves. But her decision to leave wasn't about me, it was about her. I'd convinced myself that I could hold everything together, that my effort alone was enough to keep our marriage alive. Accepting that it wasn't was a painful realization. As time went on, I began taking small steps to rebuild my life. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost in the marriage until she left. I'd always been the one who made an effort, going out of my way to ensure she was happy and that our home life was comfortable. But now, with all this time on my hands, I didn't know what to do with myself. So, I started revisiting old hobbies I'd forgotten about. I went back to the gym, picked up books I'd been meaning to read, and even experimented with cooking new recipes. Slowly, I began finding joy in these small things. Work improved too. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely keeping up with my tasks. But as I began feeling more like myself again, I put more energy into my job. It became one of the few places where I felt accomplished, where I still had some sense of control. I poured myself into my work, putting in extra hours and focusing on the details, and it paid off. Eventually, I earned a promotion, a milestone I never would have achieved if I'd stayed stuck in self-pity. Still, there were tough days. Every so often, I'd stumble across something that reminded me of her, a photo, an old movie ticket stub, or other small keepsakes tied to our time together. Those moments hurt, stirring up memories I was trying to forget. I'd catch myself wondering what she was doing, if she ever thought about me, or if she regretted what she did. But those moments became less frequent, and each time, I found it a little easier to pack away the memories and move forward. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much of since getting married. We started doing things again, hitting the golf range, going on hikes, and just enjoying each other's company. It felt good to have people in my corner who weren't tied to the mess, who could help me move on without dragging me back into the pain. Slowly but surely, I began reclaiming parts of myself that I thought I'd lost forever. Looking back, I realized I'd poured far too much of myself into that relationship, into being her husband. When she left, it felt like she'd taken a part of me with her, like I'd lost a huge piece of who I was. But, piece by piece, I began finding myself again. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but I was getting there. By the end of that year, I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by her leaving. I wasn't just the guy whose wife left him anymore. I had survived, rebuilt, and come out stronger. For the first time in years, I felt like I could live my life without her shadow looming over me. And honestly, I was proud of that. I thought I'd put it all behind me. Life had started to feel normal again, or at least as normal as it could be after everything. I had my routine, friends who kept me busy, and work was going great. I'd even stopped thinking about her every day. Sure, there were still moments when a random memory would creep in, but it wasn't like before, where every second of my life somehow revolved around her. So when I heard a knock on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, on my doorstep, holding a baby. I froze. For a moment, my brain just stopped working. It was like seeing a ghost. She looked almost the same as before, maybe a little more worn down, but still unmistakably her. She gave me this look, like she genuinely thought I'd be happy to see her. And yeah, that hit me hard. I thought I was past caring, but seeing her again stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried for good. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring, trying to process what was happening. I stood there, staring at her, completely stunned. She flashed me a smile, as if nothing had happened, and without an ounce of shame, she asked, "Can I come in?" The nerve of her. After everything she put me through, she thought she could just walk back into my life like nothing had changed. But I wasn't about to lose my composure. "No," I said firmly. "You can stay right there and explain." I wasn't going to let her into my house, the one I'd worked so hard to rebuild, the one I'd made my own since she left. She looked a little thrown off by my refusal, but she didn't back down. Instead, she launched into her story. "I know this might be a shock," she started, her voice uncertain but trying to sound calm, "but I wanted to come back and explain everything." She had this hopeful look on her face, like she genuinely believed I'd be willing to listen. It was almost laughable. I was torn. Part of me wanted to laugh in her face, and the other part wanted to just shut the door and end it right there. But my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear her excuse, to know what she had come up with to justify disappearing without a word. She started talking, her voice full of conviction as she went on about how she'd made a mistake by leaving. "I realized I lost the best thing that ever happened to me," she said, her words sharp as she looked at me with what seemed like genuine regret. "I've spent so much time reflecting, and having this baby. It's made me see what really matters in life." I tried to hold back my frustration, but the irony wasn't lost on me. Apparently, what truly mattered was showing up unannounced at my doorstep after disappearing for years. I didn't say anything at first, just stared at her, waiting for her to finish. She glanced down at the baby in her arms, and then looked up at me, her eyes filled with hope. This is our second chance, she said softly, as if she was offering me some kind of gift. A second chance? My mind raced. Was she really standing here, holding this child, expecting me to believe that everything could be reset as if none of it had ever happened? As if this baby was some sort of magical reset button that would allow us to pick up where we left off? I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was seething. I didn't interrupt as she continued. I want us to be a family again. I made a terrible mistake, but now we can start fresh. The three of us, a family again? After everything? After she'd left me without a word, without a thought? My heart was racing, but I stayed silent, waiting for her to realize how absurd this all sounded. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. Why did you leave? The question had been eating at me since the moment she showed up on my doorstep. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. I had spent years wondering, torturing myself with every possible explanation, and now that she was here, I needed to hear the truth from her. No more guessing. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her feet like she was ashamed. For a moment, she didn't say anything. It felt like an eternity before she finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine. I left because I wanted a child, she said, her tone so casual, as if she was talking about something insignificant. You couldn't give me that, so I found someone who could. I was stunned. Just like that. I couldn't believe how easily she said it, like it wasn't the most painful thing she could have told me. You walked away from everything we had for that? She didn't seem to fully understand the gravity of what she had done. I know it seems harsh, but that's what I needed, she said, almost apologetically, but not enough to sound sorry. The guy I left with, he didn't stick around. But by then, I had the baby. I clenched my jaw, feeling the heat rise in my chest. This wasn't the answer I had been hoping for. It was worse than I could have imagined. And then what? I asked, barely able to get the words out. You think you can just come back now, like everything's okay? She looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at me, her voice softening. After everything that happened, I realized, I want you back. I want us to be a family again. Just like that. Simple. She had the baby, and now everything could be fixed. I had no idea what to say. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I stood there, trying to process what she just told me. Every word she spoke felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't let her see how much it was affecting me. She was standing there, admitting she had abandoned me, ran off with another man, had his baby, and now expected me to just forgive it all and act like nothing had happened. As if it was that simple. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady, and looked her straight in the eye. So, let me get this straight. You left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back and pretend like nothing happened? Her eyes filled with tears almost immediately, and she started crying. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I made a huge mistake. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, you have to believe me. I want us to be together. I realize now, you're the one I truly love. We were meant to be. Her words hit my ears, but they didn't land the way she hoped. I wasn't moved. Not even a little. I watched her, emotion spilling from her like a broken faucet, but all I could feel was anger and disbelief. You think you can just walk back in after everything you did? I asked, my voice low. You think tears are enough to fix this? She continued, barely able to catch her breath between sobs. Please. I've been through so much. I've realized what I lost. I know we belong together. I want to start over. For us. For the baby. I couldn't help but scoff. The whole thing felt surreal. She honestly thought I'd just fall for this? It wasn't love. It was desperation. I could see it all over her face. She was trying to manipulate me into feeling bad for her, but it wasn't going to work. Her tears continued to flow, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. It's been so hard being a single mom, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I've struggled so much. You don't know what it's like. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, that's your excuse? I asked, barely able to keep the frustration out of my voice. You're trying to guilt-trip me into coming back because you've had a hard time being a mom? She looked taken aback by my words, as if she expected more sympathy. I just thought you'd understand, she said quietly. We could be a family again, but I was done. I shook my head, not giving her a chance to say more. No, you don't get to just waltz back in and expect me to pick up where we left off. You made your choice, and I'm not going to be your safety net. She kept talking, her voice growing more frantic with each word, trying to make herself out to be the victim in all of this. You don't understand, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. It's been so hard for me, trying to do it all on my own. I just need your support. I'm ready now. I'm ready to make things work this time. The whole time she was speaking, I was wondering who she thought I was. She had made her choices, and now here she was, acting like I owed her something. The more she spoke, the more exhausted I felt, like I was listening to the same broken record I'd heard too many times before. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. You made your choice a long time ago, I said, my voice firm. And now, you have to live with it. There's no second chance here. Her face went pale, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She took a step back, clearly stunned by my words. It was as if she truly thought I'd just welcome her back into my life, no questions asked, because it was suddenly convenient for her. For a moment, I thought she might just walk away, but then her demeanor changed. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice shifted to something sharper, more accusatory. Selfish, she yelled, her words biting. You're so selfish. You don't even care how hard this has been for me. I deserve a chance to make things right. I stood my ground, refusing to let her manipulate me again, but she wasn't done. Her words became more frantic, more desperate. You owe me this. You owe me the chance to fix everything, she shouted, her face flushed with anger. I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have divorced you and taken half of everything. This house should still be mine. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The nerve of her, bringing up the house like it was some kind of bargaining chip. I shook my head, disbelief mixing with anger. The house isn't yours. It never was, not after what you did. You don't get to claim anything from me now. Her face twisted, her anger clearly boiling over. She was caught up in her own version of reality, expecting me to feel guilty or regretful, but I wasn't going to be swayed. You're not getting anything from me, I said coldly, and I don't owe you a damn thing. As she continued to raise her voice, I realized I was finally seeing her for who she truly was. All the confusion and frustration I'd carried for years started to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. This was the person she had become, and I wasn't going to be dragged back into it. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I just looked at her, steady and calm, and said, "We're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore." Her face contorted with anger, but I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and shut the door in her face, the sound of her muffled shouts on the other side barely registering. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. She could knock, yell, or cry. It didn't matter. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence sink in. I knew in that instant that she would never be allowed back in. The woman I had loved, the woman I had married, was gone. And in her place was this stranger who thought she could come back whenever it suited her, expecting me to pick up the pieces. But I wasn't going to do that anymore. With one final, resolute breath, I turned away from the door and walked into my house, leaving her behind where she belonged. Part of a past I was finally ready to let go of. I turned away from the door and sank into the chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. I thought that was it, that she'd get the message and leave me alone. But then, I heard it, the banging on the door, followed by her yelling. I couldn't believe her nerve. Here I was, finally in the one place that was mine. The one place I had painstakingly rebuilt after the wreckage she left behind, and she was still demanding that I listen to her. At first, I considered ignoring her, letting her scream herself out until she got tired. But curiosity got the better of me. What kind of excuses would she throw at me this time? So, I opened the door just a crack, enough to show her I was listening, but not enough to let her in. She looked completely stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief, probably shocked that I hadn't reacted the way she expected. She took a moment, clearly trying to process that I wasn't playing along with her usual games. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice shaky. I kept my tone steady. "I'm listening. But this time, I'm not letting you in." She blinked, searching for the words, but all she could manage was a frustrated sigh. She immediately started in, launching into this long speech about how she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door in her face, like it was some small mistake, and how she was ready to start fresh. She acted like we were just in the middle of a regular argument, not addressing the fact that she had abandoned me in the first place. She went on about how we could make things work if we both put in the effort, how we could pick up where we left off. At that moment, I couldn't help it. I laughed. The sheer nerve of this woman was beyond belief. She looked furious when I did that, like I was supposed to feel guilty for not taking her seriously. I wiped the laugh off my face and said, "You left. You had your chance, and you threw it all away. I'm not going to pretend none of that happened just because you feel like it." Her face went bright red, and she immediately fired back. You don't understand how hard it was for me. She started rambling about how lost she had been after leaving, how she thought she knew what she wanted but had realized too late that she'd made a mistake. I wasn't buying any of it. I stared at her, calm but firm, and said, leaving was a choice you made. You planned it, you lied about it, and you went through with it. Your regret doesn't mean anything now. She looked at me, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe I wasn't backing down. But I had nothing left to give her. That's when she snapped. Her whole tone shifted in an instant. The sad, remorseful act she'd been putting on completely dropped, and the anger came pouring out. She started accusing me of being unfair, of not having the decency to give her another chance. Her voice got louder as she went on, and then she hit me with it. If I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have taken half of everything you own. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what she was saying. This woman, the one who had left me without a word, now thought she deserved some kind of reward for not trying to ruin me financially. As if I should be grateful she hadn't been as terrible as she could have been. I couldn't believe it. I looked at her, my voice steady but dripping with disbelief. So what, am I supposed to be grateful? Grateful that you ditched me and didn't take my stuff with you? She didn't even have a response to that. For a second, we just stood there, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But I wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't going to be manipulated by guilt or some warped sense of entitlement. I was done. She stared at me, her face a mix of anger and something else, desperation, guilt, maybe both. But honestly, at that point, I didn't care. I was done. All those years I spent feeling guilty, questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow responsible for her leaving. They melted away in that moment. I finally saw her for who she truly was, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off me. But she wasn't done. She started pacing on my porch, her voice rising as she went off about how I'd never find anyone like her. You'll regret this, she said, her words sharp. You'll never find someone who understands you like I do. You're making a huge mistake. I shook my head, not sure if I should laugh or be angry. I hope I never find anyone else like you. Damn you, she shot back, hands flailing in frustration. You'll see. One day, you'll realize that you let the best thing in your life slip away. It was bizarre. Here she was, the one who had destroyed everything we had, acting like I should be begging her to stay. She was the one who left, the one who shattered our life, and now she was trying to flip the script on me. The nerve of her. I crossed my arms, standing firm. I didn't destroy anything. You did that all on your own. She stopped pacing for a second, almost like she was thrown off by my response, but then she started again, trying to spin it like I was the one who was being unreasonable. But there was no changing my mind. I was done playing along with her games. When she saw I wasn't budging, she got louder, claiming that I'd forced her to leave in the first place. She said that if I'd been more understanding about the whole kid situation, none of this would have happened. According to her, my inability to give her a child meant I had failed her as a husband, which somehow justified her running off to have one with someone else. The mental gymnastics were impressive. Honestly, I couldn't believe she was trying to pin her choices on me. I looked her dead in the eye and said, if you wanted a kid that badly, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine while planning your escape. She just stood there, frozen, staring at me like I'd slapped her. But I wasn't about to let her get a word in. I pressed on. You made that choice on your own, and now you have to live with it. That's not my problem. Her face shifted again, and she switched tactics. The sad, remorseful act came back as she held the child closer to her chest. Please, she begged, her voice soft, think about him. He needs you. He deserves a family. I couldn't believe she was trying this one last guilt trip, using the child as some kind of weapon to make me feel responsible. But I wasn't having it. I stepped forward, my voice firm. I don't know that child. I have nothing to do with him. He's not mine, and neither are you. Her face fell, the sad facade crumbling, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. But there was no turning back now. I wasn't falling for it. That was it. I could see the realization hit her. She knew I wasn't going to change my mind, that I wasn't going to let her back into my life. I saw the anger fade, replaced by something else. Maybe regret, maybe frustration, but it didn't matter anymore. She was just a stranger now, a stranger who had tried to walk all over me and thought I would just smile and thank her for it. She stood there for a few more seconds, like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to call her back. But I didn't say another word. I just watched her face as it finally dawned on her that I meant every word. Without saying anything more, I shut the door, and this time, I didn't wait for her to bang on it again. I knew deep down I had made my decision, and there was no going back. I walked away from the door, feeling, I don't know, like I'd finally won. She had spent so much time thinking she could come back and manipulate her way into my life, but it was over. I was free. There wasn't going to be a second chance, not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now, one I had finally put in the past where it belonged. After all those years of guilt and pain, I finally felt like I could breathe again. And you know what? It felt good. The moment I closed that door on her, a strange calm washed over me. I wasn't angry, sad, or even shocked anymore. It was like every ounce of energy I'd spent on her, all the regret, the guilt, the endless wondering, just disappeared. I'd finally gotten the closure I didn't even know I needed, and I was ready to move on. It was over, for real, this time. But of course, things didn't end as cleanly as I had hoped. A few days later, I got a text from her mom. She was apologizing, saying she was ashamed of how her daughter had handled everything, and that she had tried to talk some sense into her, but clearly, it hadn't worked. Her mom was a good person. She'd helped me out a lot after her daughter left, and I could tell she was genuinely upset about everything. I didn't hold anything against her, but I wasn't interested in getting roped back into that mess. I simply replied with a polite thanks for checking in and left it at that. I wasn't about to give her mom any more details or waste time explaining my decision. She understood enough to know it was over. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she'd gone back to living with her parents, and it wasn't going smoothly. The guy she'd left me for, the father of the kid, had completely bailed. He hadn't signed up for the long haul, and now she was left trying to figure things out on her own. She had pretty much burned every bridge, and there weren't many people willing to lend a hand. Her old friends, the ones who had supported me when she first disappeared, had no sympathy for her. They'd all moved on and weren't eager to get dragged back into her drama. I couldn't blame them. Her parents weren't thrilled either. They weren't in a great financial position to support her and the baby. I knew this because, not long after receiving the text from her mom, I got a call from her dad. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the best of me. He was polite but direct. He mentioned they were struggling to make ends meet and hinted that maybe I could help out a little. He said, "We know you cared about her once," and kept going on about the baby and how hard things were for them. I listened politely, but when he started talking about how his daughter just needed a little support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but chuckle, quietly of course. I told him as kindly as I could that his daughter's choices were her own, and I wasn't in a position, or mindset, to help. I think he got the message, because he didn't press the matter any further. Then her friends started reaching out, people I hadn't heard from in years. A few tried the guilt trip, saying she was going through a tough time and maybe I could find it in my heart to give her another chance. One friend even had the nerve to suggest that the kid needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let my bitterness stand in the way of helping him. But I stood firm. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel guilty for finally choosing myself after years of feeling like I wasn't enough. I had given that woman everything, and she threw it away. The least she could do was on her decisions instead of expecting me to bail her out. Over time, the calls and messages slowed down and eventually stopped altogether. It was like everyone finally realized I was serious, that I had moved on and wasn't going to get pulled back in. That's when the real peace settled in. My life felt calm, normal, in a way it hadn't in years. I had my routines, my friends, my work. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was mine, and I had rebuilt it on my terms. The funny thing is, I started finding happiness in the little things again, things I hadn't really noticed when I was married. I'd go for walks, cook my own meals, read books I'd meant to get to for years. The freedom was refreshing, and I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to live the way I wanted. For once, I wasn't constantly worried about someone else's approval or happiness. It was like I'd gotten my life back, piece by piece. Every now and then, I'd run into someone who knew both of us, and they'd ask, "Hey, whatever happened with her?" I'd give a brief, polite answer and change the subject. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. I just didn't want to keep revisiting a chapter that was clearly over. She was part of my past, and I had finally learned how to leave her there. As for her, the last I heard, things weren't going well. She was struggling to keep a job, still bouncing between her parents' place and friends' couches when she wore out her welcome. People I barely talked to anymore would message me occasionally, telling me she was asking for help from just about anyone who'd listen. Some of them even hinted that she was hoping I'd change my mind, that maybe I'd come around and decide to play the dad to her kid after all. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd spent too much time and energy getting my life back to even think about going down that road. I wasn't going to be her safety net, and I wasn't going to be the guy who picks up the pieces just because things didn't go the way she planned. I was done with that chapter, and nothing was going to pull me back in. In the end, I felt like I got the closure I needed. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. As for me, I finally felt free, truly, genuinely free. In a way I hadn't since the day she left. I was done letting her shadow loom over my life. I had moved on, and I was content. Not happy in some grand, dramatic way, but quietly and peacefully content. And you know what? That was enough. It wasn't something I expected, but life has a way of surprising you when you least anticipate it. A few months after I had truly let go of everything related to her, I started to notice a shift in my own life. I was out one evening with some friends, just catching up over drinks, when I met Mia. She wasn't anything like I had expected. She was calm, kind, and easy to talk to, with no hidden agendas or past baggage. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was something about her that made me want to get to know her better. We started seeing each other casually at first, just dinners, walks, and movies. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something other than the quiet peace I had come to enjoy. It was like rediscovering joy in the little things again. Mia didn't rush anything, and she made me feel safe, like I could truly be myself without fear of judgment. With her, I could just be, and that was something I hadn't felt in a long time. As we spent more time together, it became clear that she was someone I could see a future with. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was the comfort of knowing she was there, a partner who understood me without trying to fix me or change me. We were a team, and it felt right. A year passed, and I found myself thinking about the future. Mia and I had built something real, something that felt genuine, without the complications or misunderstandings that had plagued my past. One evening, under the soft glow of the setting sun, I proposed to her. She said yes, and just like that, I knew I was ready to take this step forward with her. I was about to get married again, but this time, it was different. This wasn't about healing wounds or fixing mistakes. It was about two people choosing to build something beautiful from the ground up, together. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.